With a start, Hiveltak awoke, surrounded by silence and destruction. The plane must have crashed while he was asleep. Desperately, he tried to remember what happened, while his whole body ached. He had decided to get some sleep in the save cabin of a plane while he crossed the Atlantic, as the humans called it, going from his meeting with the leaders of the western continents to stay in the central continent of this planet. His diplomatic mission had gone well so far. Despite the many stories of the oh-so-deadly planet Earth, he had not felt unsafe once while under the humans' care on that planet. In fact, despite the many stories about the many dangers of this highly volatile world, there had so far not been a single off-worlder fatality on the planet, so he really had nothing to worry about. Now it seemed that he had come quite close to possibly being the number one in that statistic, and over something as mundane as a plane crash as well. Groaning and seeing some stars flashing for his vision, he slowly pushed himself to his feet. Despite his aching head and the ringing in his ears, his arms and legs felt surprisingly light as he employed them to slowly shove himself out of the surrounding scrap and rubble. He only briefly glanced around in the blindingly bright light, but he could see it clearly. Everything around him was destroyed. All kinds of plastic polymers had been shattered and were strewn about in tiny pieces, or fibrous, ripped parts all around. Enormous parts of thick metal, many times his own size, were bent and broken, with deep dents bending sharp edges away from their intended positions in malformed curves. Not too far from him, there were even some fires burning on the destroyed remains of the plane that had been so utterly demolished here. Quickly he inspected himself. His 4 flat arms gently tapped all over his body, but to both his relief and his surprise, he appeared to be mostly uninjured. He had scratches and bumps, and most likely some form of whiplash or concussion, if his aching head was anything to go by, but he was alive and not seriously wounded. His upper heart fluttered for a moment. It was a miracle, really. He took another look at the devastation around him. Somehow he had survived all this with minimal injury. He had heard about events like this, of course, or people miraculously surviving despite near insurmountable odds, but he had never imagined something like that would happen to him. Then again, he also never imagined he would ever be in something as rare as a plane crash. But right now, he couldn't concentrate on that. Just because he had miraculously survived the crash didn't mean that he was back in the reef yet. Now that he had survived, he would have to focus on keeping it that way. He had no idea if the area he had so harshly been forced to land in was dangerous. After all, this was still Earth. Surely someone had noticed the disappearance of the plane, and would come looking for it soon. But he would have to do his best to survive this famously deadly planet, until the time help would arrive. As he forced himself to look around again, despite the painfully bright light, his 4-cone eyes simply refused to become used to the conditions of this place. He really wished that he still had his goggles, but they must have gotten lost somewhere in the crash. Although today, the blinding light of the Earth's harsh star felt especially unforgiving. It was like the light was forming a sort of ethereal haze around him, that only allowed him to clearly see what was almost right beside him, turning everything else into shadowy silhouettes. The burning wreckage of the plane was in sight. It had crashed on what looked to be an open, grassy plateau area on the side of a mountain. If he looked in the direction that led down the slope, he could see a forest of dark, pointy trees growing tall a bit further down, and in the other direction, there was the ever-scaling wall of land that soon even seemed to strip itself of dirt and grass and became sheer rock as it soared further up into the clouds. He shuddered at the sight. A place such as that one, that seemed to have shed all signs of life from itself many long ages ago, was the last thing that he needed in his mind right now. The forest further down looked more promising. However, although it was hard to admit it to himself, he feared what he might find there. The tails of the beasts of Earth with their hardened claws, natural weapons of hardened bodily material developed specifically to cut, hold, and maim their screaming, and more importantly still living prey, had never specifically scared him before. After all, even after he had been chosen for this diplomatic mission to one of the deadliest of planets, he had seen it as a routine venture. As long as he would remain cordial with his assigned security and stay within the confines of the highly modernized human cities, he would be fine. After all, humans, despite their dangerous home that had forged them into capable and sturdy survivors, were also highly intelligent and, more importantly, extremely empathic. They would know how to keep their guests safe within their walls. They enjoyed the comfort of not worrying about their own lives constantly as well. At one point, he had even gotten to meet the much friendlier descendants of some of the oh-so-feared wild beasts, and the experiences had overall been a pleasant one. Granted, these individuals were very sternly trained, and everything happened under the careful supervision of human professionals, but Hippolyte still had to admit that it had been hard to see any of the dangerous monsters that were so often talked about, in the droopy eyes and excitedly wagging tails of these dog creatures, and he could tell why humans were so incredibly fond of them. However, now that he was out in the wilderness and confronted with the prospect of possibly running into their wilder, less friendly relatives, he did remember those claws on their feet that had only playfully scratched at his clothes when they had tried to get his attention, and still, he could feel their sharp tips on his skin even through the thick fabric. And he remembered the fangs in their mouths that had almost been the size of one of his shorter fingers. He swallowed heavily. It would probably be best to remain near the wreckage, he reasoned. After all, how was any possible help that was on its way ever going to find him in the dense forest down below? They would arrive to think he was gone already, surely. It would be better to remain right here. Right out into the open, where he would be seen immediately by anyone that came looking for him. Right here in the wide, grassy plateau, where there was no place to sneak up on him from. Lost in thought, he patted himself down again. He was still amazed that he had somehow gotten out of that crash as intact as he was. A thought flashed through his mind. If he had survived it like this, surely the much sturdier humans had to have gotten out of this crash as well, right? For a moment, his heart fluttered in elation. However, his more reasonable mind quickly quelled his hopeful but naive emotions. He knew that was not how this worked. In a crash like this, mere millimeters could mean the difference between life and death. Just because they were sturdier than him didn't mean that the poor primates had also had his luck in this crash. If they had survived as intact as he was, they would surely already be out here with him, looking around in this environment that was so much more native and familiar to them than it was to him. And if they had gotten hit harder, then he wouldn't know what to do. He wasn't a survivor. He wasn't too proud to admit that to himself, but much less than his own life would he have known how to protect that of a dying human. If he found one, what would he do? He couldn't answer that question, not even in his mind. However, honor and basic decency still demanded that he should at the very least go look for them. After all, he was sent here on a diplomatic mission. Should he survive this, how could he ever look anyone in the eyes again if he just sat here and waited for rescue, while some of his hosts were possibly painfully dying around him? With resolve, he clenched all four of his hands into pitiful fists, as he resolved to go rifle through the wreckage, leave not a single piece of rubble unturned, until the time he could be sure he had not missed a single survivor. And then, as he was ready to take the first step towards the wreck, there was a sound. Loud enough to pierce the ringing in his ears, he could hear the sound of something shifting. Grass was gently crinkling and singeing, as if something heavy was being dragged through its blades, and whatever made it was coming closer. Was it a survivor already? How great! But wait, that did not sound like human steps. There was no rhythmic thump-thump of their two heavy legs hitting the ground in an even beat. Were they dragging themselves across the ground? No. Even then the human would have to individually employ their laterally symmetric parts alternatively to achieve locomotion, meaning even then there should have been that rhythm dictating their action, like it did for everything in a human's life. But this noise wasn't that. It was long and continuous, like something that had made crawling or slithering its life purpose without ever slowing down. And more importantly, he now realized that it was coming from the wrong direction. Slowly, Hippolyte turned around to face the thing that was approaching him from the direction of the downward slope there. The ringing in his ears got louder with the movement, and almost threatened to drown out the dreaded, ever-nearing sound. And through the haze that the light brought to blind his eyes, he couldn't see anything either. Something was there. He knew it. His instinct screamed it at him. Something big. something heavy, but he just couldn't see it. And now he threatened to lose his hearing of it as well. He took a step back as the sound got louder and louder as it approached, but so did the ringing. He couldn't see. He couldn't hear. What could he do? What could he do? His mind raced, but didn't find answers. However, answers that his mind didn't find, his body provided. Because as his own four eyes caught sight of the vague outline of a large thing, slowly pushing itself towards him, even through the haze for the first time, his legs no longer waited for an order from his major brain. Without waiting for any rational or even conscious thought, they turned and ran on their own, taking the rest of his body with them as he tore away from that thing. As his legs were doing the running, his brain tried to process what it had seen. The thing was large. Too large. He had been shown the larger animals dwelling the lands of Earth, and they simply weren't that big, weren't that massive. And that wasn't even mentioning its form. Its awfully formless form. The creatures of Earth had internal skeletons. At least all the bigger ones did. They all had form, they had structure, and due to their shared ancestry, they all looked somewhat alike. This creature had none of that. It didn't have structure. It didn't even really have form. It was like a constantly revolving mass of mass that pushed itself forward by impossible unknown means. Most of its enormous, bulbous body was just round, but it was terrifyingly broken up by... His mind refused to give him an answer to what it was. He wanted to call it tendrils or tentacles, or arms or something of the like, but all of that just wasn't correct. They were simply animate protrusions of flesh, moving around seemingly on their own as they snapped to the air with their giant maws. Maws, flat and formless, like the rest of the thing, apart from the teeth. He could see the teeth in them. In size, they put even those of the larger dogs he had seen to absolute shame. The fangs were bent and crooked, and didn't seem to follow any reason in the ways with which they were placed inside of the maws, but they had form. They had structure. Awful and malformed, but no less dangerous. They didn't make a sound as they snapped to the air aggressively, seemingly trying to pull the rest of the uniformed body along, as they pushed forwards and strained against the confines provided to them by their own flesh. Meanwhile, all that could be heard was just the gentle rustle of grass. Hiveltak sprinted on. At first he tried to hide behind some of the wreckage, but it proved to be of no use. He didn't know if the thing had seen where he had hidden himself, or if it simply always knew where he was by some other means, but he could always feel it being right on his trail, moving closer with its constant, never-slowing slithering over the earth. And he still couldn't see, though maybe that was a blessing. The one glance he had been able to take at the thing had been more than enough for his mind to be sent into absolute panic. He didn't even want to know what seeing it at all times might possibly do. Surely help was on its way, and this thing wasn't very fast. He would just have to keep avoiding it until... His feet suddenly dug into the ground, sending him tumbling forward from his sprint, and making him hit the grass hard as he tried to catch himself with his forearms. Why had he tried to so suddenly stop? Because over the haze and the constant ringing, his ears had picked up on something else. Something almost right in front of him. No, that couldn't be. He had left the thing far behind him. It was slower than him. It couldn't have. He could feel his eyes widen in horror, as his hands clenched shut, digging into the ground beneath him. Another noise came from just behind him. There was more than one. He had no idea how many. At that moment, his mind nearly resigned to die right there. How long could he escape from something he could barely see or hear? How many of them were there? Would there even still be a place to run soon, if they kept coming? His body moving by itself once again, while his mind thought of inevitabilities, it pushed itself in the one direction that was still left to go, up the mountain, towards the cold, dead stone. He didn't quite manage to get up. It was like his legs had lost their strength, or maybe the ground beneath him just didn't want to carry his weight anymore. He couldn't quite tell what was wrong, but something wouldn't allow him to stand. and so he crawled. Crawled away from these monstrosities that came after him. Crawled over hard rocks and sharp stones, always further up. Crawled and crawled until he could crawl no more. Something was in front of him. At first he thought he had missed another beast, but no. Looking up in the blinding haze, he saw a boulder, or maybe even a cliff face. Sheer rock, standing high and blocking his way. And behind him he could still hear the slithering. It had increased in intensity, and he could tell that there were more of them now. Finally, his body allowed him to collapse. There was nowhere left to go. He was outnumbered. His legs wouldn't carry him, and there was nowhere left to go. He couldn't run and he couldn't hide. All he could do was wait and think of home as the slithering beasts came closer and closer until he could see them, even through the haze of the blinding light. Their slavering maws snapped at the air with their crooked teeth, urging the fat, bulbous bodies to hurry up so they could get to him already as they strained against their fleshy prisons silently. He imagined what they would feel like once they got to him, how it would feel to be torn apart by such grotesque beings. The anticipation was tearing him apart just as much. But the bodies were patient, and he and the mouths would have to wait. They moved at their own speed, unburdened by terrain or their own begging maws. They only moved, always moved, ever constantly, and ever with the same speed. He could count the seconds as the nearest one came closer. 1, 2. The nearest maw was only an arm's reach away from him now. 3. It snapped the air above his leg, its fleshy chains restraining it just enough so it couldn't reach it from the place it was attached to its abhorrent body. 4. It was just inches from his body now, its brothers twisting and turning to try to get at him, as well, before the first one could have him all to itself. 5. A shadow passed over Hilvertag's face, blocking out the blinding haze for just a second, as the maw was just about to take his first terrible bite out of his flesh. But then it was suddenly forced back, as something large and heavy landed on the fleshy protrusion that connected it to its host, making the maw snap backwards in a painful-looking twist, as his neck was suddenly pulled down and crushed under the weight of a large rock that had seemingly rained from the sky. At first it seemed to be a fluke, but another rock quickly hit the creature. Much smaller than the first one, but it flew a lot faster, and it precisely hit one of the other snapping maws, causing it to stop its constant biting and mashing in a stunned daze. More stones began to rain, and then even more. Rock after rock came flinging down from the top of the cliff that Hilvertag had been stalked against, and most of them hit true, stopping more and more of the snapping maws in their movements, and leaving the bodies as a mere toothless mass. New sounds pierced through the ringing, crackling and chafing. Something was coming down the cliff. Nimbly, and with the so typical strength in their movements, humans started to climb down from above, landing right next to Hilvertag. Some of them ran past him right away, towards the beast that had stalked him, and they walked around yelling and shouting, hopping and jumping and waving their arms or doing anything they could to attract the beast's attentions. It worked, although it seemed to have little to do with their flamboyant attempts at distraction. Much rather, it seemed that whoever was closest to the monstrosities would have their full focus on them, no matter who they were or what they did. Getting that close to the beast seemed dangerous, of course, however the humans were quick and nimble. They distracted the maws with their long arms, and easily pulled them back to safety much faster than the horrible teeth could reach them. Their strong legs carried them over their home soil as quickly and lightly as they were bred for, so staying out of the body's ranges was no problem for them either. And even if they had been in danger at any point, their brethren were still on top of that cliff, throwing and tossing stones and rocks with deathly speed and precision, driving some of the beasts back, or at least holding them at bay with pain and injury provided by the projectiles. Like they had been made for it, the humans danced around the creatures, keeping their attention away, while two more of the primates grasped Hilvertag's shoulders with their strong hands and pulled him up to his feet. His legs still had trouble carrying him, but the humans effortlessly pulled him along and away from the beasts, towards safety further up. Even through the haze he recognized some of them. They had been on the plane as well. Had everyone made it out then? How wonderful. "Thank you," he hoarsely mumbled, glad that his voice still worked despite everything. "Don't mention it," one of the humans carrying him replied while breathing heavily. "Sorry for leaving you behind earlier. We didn't think you made it." "I wouldn't have thought so either." Hiveltak dismissed their worries with an appreciative breath before trying to look back. However, the light was too blinding, and already the gnashing maws and dancing humans had left his vision again. Still, he asked, "What are those beasts?" As if he could see them. The human let out a strained huff and shook his head. "No idea," he said, with some fear creeping into his mighty voice. "I've never seen anything like them. Nor sure anyone has. Whatever they are, they aren't from Earth." Even the humans didn't know? How could that be? This was their home, wasn't it? Oh, cruel fate. What tricks were you playing here? Once Hiveltak, aided by the humans, had made it a good way up the mountain, one of the men carrying him turned around to yell at their left-behind brethren, who were still competing with who knows how many of those beasts had congregated around the wreckage by now. "We got him! Get out of there!" he shouted. And soon footsteps could be heard hurrying towards them, much faster than their own since carrying Hiveltak slowed his companions down significantly, due to his size alone. Looking around, he could see more of the apes. They leaped down, picking up stones and rocks that were scattered all around their feet, and tossing them down the slope where the beast still had to be. But that would only stop them for so long, and there would be more. "What do we do?" Hiveltak therefore asked the humans, looking for any reassurance that could be provided to him. The human's face darkened. "We keep running," he said. "We can't run forever," Hiveltak immediately protested. He couldn't even run right now, and the humans wouldn't be able to forever either. There had to be something better to do. He felt it inside him. There was something they had to do, but he just didn't know what. It was just like with his legs. It was as if something was wrong. Just wrong, without any more context to it. As if the thing that was meant to be just wasn't. Wasn't here. Wasn't at all. The human shook his head sternly. "We won't have to," he said. "We just have to keep going until help arrives. It won't be much longer." He said it with such certainty, as if it was something he deeply believed in. But what help would there be? And how could it arrive quickly enough to get them out of here? These beasts just kept coming. He didn't see them or hear them, but he knew it. And he was sure that the humans did as well. "We have to keep moving," the human repeated. "Keep slowing them down until help arrives." Hiveltak didn't have it in him to argue. He felt more of his strength leave him by the moment. Maybe the crash had done more damage than he had first imagined. Suddenly there was a scream, ripping through the haze and the ringing in his ears as clear as day. Everyone shot around to look in its direction, Hiveltak included. "Dear God," one of the humans carrying him mumbled, his eyes widening widely as he loosened one hand to move it around in front of his body, likely performing a specific ritual with its movements. "Mother of," the other mumbled, stopping short before he could say anything concrete, just remaining standing there with his mouth hanging open as he stared up at the shape that was emerging and kept all humans' eyes glued onto itself. Hiveltak saw it as well. Despite the haze, he could see it in the distance. It was towering. He had thought the previous monstrosities had been big, but this one dwarfed them easily, even towering over the trees that it traversed with his height. It wasn't as formless as the others, although it didn't really have a form either. It was comparable to a huge worm, except it wasn't just one thing. Instead, it was many things. Many massive tubes of mass endlessly encircling each other in a spiral that slowly crawled across the land, moving tree tops aside like a wind as it ascended the mountain. And it ascended quickly. And at the end of each of the fleshy tubes there was another one of those horrible maws. Soon, it had already left the trees behind it and entered the grassy terrain following them further up. It was unimaginable how fast it must have been moving. Instinctively, everyone knew there was no running from this. Suddenly, Hiveltak felt himself being dropped, and once again he landed hard on the ground. He suspected that humans had let go of him so they could flee faster themselves. He couldn't blame them for it. He would have likely done the same had the tables been turned. He wanted to at least see what was to come, so he used his forearms to fight himself upright enough to look ahead towards the spiraling approach of death. And he saw that the humans weren't running, at least not away, They were charging towards the beast, like they had done before they picked up whatever they could find at their feet, tossing it at the monstrum as hard as they could. A valiant effort, but ultimately useless. It was too big. What would some rocks do to it? But despite its size, and although it had no face, you could see it. See that the beast was hurting. It made no sound, but clearly as many more still screamed as the rain of stone came down upon it. It was never going to fall to such an attack, but it did hurt it. And, other than its much smaller predecessors, it did slow from the pain. The humans retreated further and further up the mountain again as the thing kept coming, but they never let up their assault. Finally, as they slowly stepped backwards, they were once again on one level, with where Hilvertak was still laying on the ground helplessly. Two of them, two others than before, bent down to pick him up again, dragging him away from the fight while the others kept tossing. But no matter how they slowed it down, the thing kept coming, and it was coming closer. Soon, the humans at the front were forced to stop their assault, as they turned and ran before the thing could reach them. While running, they were faster than it now, but only while running. More and more apes were forced to turn and run, as the huge, gnashing maws of the thing kept coming closer. At least it seemed to have scared away all the other monstrosities that had previously surrounded them. All the humans who ran could get to safety. They were fast enough now, but two of them couldn't run. For all their strength, they couldn't carry Hilvertak at a full sprint. He was too big, too unwieldy. With the way things were going, he would pull the two of them to their death with him, and the Moors were coming closer. "Leave me," he ordered through the ringing in his ears. "Save yourselves." "No way, Jose," one of the humans, a larger male, grunted. "Not gonna happen." The other one, a female, concurred. "That thing can't have you." Hilvertak sighed. "You've done enough," he said. "Don't die because of me." However, the humans vehemently shook their heads. "That thing can't have you." The male human repeated the female's words firmly, through clenched teeth, seemed to be driven by a deep determination. They tried their best to quicken their steps, but it was of no use. They simply couldn't carry him fast enough. He would be the cause of their demise. All Hilvertak could do was look back as he was carried along, and stare up at the ever-revolving maws that were about to devour all of them whole. Suddenly, something else came into view. A black figure. It was clearly visible through the light's blinding mist. In fact, it was so dark that it seemed to suck in the hazy light around it, like a black hole swallowing a star. The being flew over the spiraling mass of maws on long, dark wings, effortlessly outpacing it as it caught up to the humans. It was carrying something in both hands, although at first Hilvertak could not recognize what it was. The item was long, with a sharp curve at its end that seemed to be made of a different material, that was just as dark as the person themselves. Soaring past above them at blinding speed, they turned in midair, losing all their momentum immediately before falling to the earth, landing heavily right in front of Hilvertak and his human carriers. Hilvertak looked at the being in shock, not able to make out a single feature of it, as it still seemed to swallow all light. He didn't know if he should fear it more or less than the whirling mass of death behind him. The humans, on the other hand, lit up in elation, their faces showing expressions of pure joy. As they beamed up at the tall being, it unfurled its wings and leaned back, lifting the item it held in both hands as it turned its body, clearly ready to strike. "Help is here!" the man carrying Hilvertak screamed out, just as the tension in the dark being's body released. Now Hilvertak knew what the item was. A weapon. Its end gleamed like a blade and whistled while it cut through the air, as its owner brought it down against the human quickly. "No!" Hilvertak yelled out, and tried his best to warn and move the human, but it was too late. The dark blade slashed through the man with the same ease that it sliced through the air with, and in an instant, the ape had vanished into nothingness. No blood, no scream, no corpse. He was just there one moment, and then he was not. Hilvertak didn't even have time to notice how one of his sides was without support now, when the being already brought the weapon around at lightning speed, slicing his second carrier just as callously as it had the first, now taking all support from his weight, as she vanished just as her brother had before her. Immediately, Hilvertak felt himself falling to the ground again now that he was unheld, but not before he saw the dark being raise its weapon once again, this time high above his head. He knew that he wouldn't even hit the ground before it would slice through him as well, and he shut his eyes tightly as he waited for the strike to come. But it never came. There was not whistling of the blade, no cutting feeling running him through. The being hesitated, and instead, he suddenly felt a hard force gripping him, pulling him up, and then he felt as he was lifted off the ground and pulled along, through the air at amazing speed. He opened his eyes. He dangled from the being's hand, his face pointing towards the ground. The being's presence alone removed the haze from his vision, and he could see the humans below. They were cheering, celebrating, jumping in place with their arms raised to this unknown attacker. Didn't they see what had happened to their brethren? As soon as it had taken flight, the being landed again, and it quickly tossed Hiveltak aside, although it made sure that he landed in a position where he could both see the still approaching spiraling worm of Moors, and the being as it went about its grim work. The humans didn't run. They didn't fight back. One after the other, they simply stood and waited for their fate, as the being's weapons sliced through each of them one by one. Some even bowed to the being, or gave it quick words of thanks, before its blade entered their life and vanished them into nothingness. Hiveltak couldn't understand it. After the last human was taken out, beheaded as she bowed to the dark servant of demise, the being turned around again and walked towards Hiveltak with quick steps. With overwhelming strength, it grabbed him by the collar and lifted him up to his feet, where he suddenly found the strength to stand on his own again, as if the being had sucked away his weakness, just as it had absorbed the blinding light. "What are you?" Hiveltak immediately asked it fearfully, seeing as it once again didn't raise its weapon against him, like it had done to the humans. "I should be asking that question," the dark being replied, no movement on its ever-obscure features indicating how it could talk. "You don't belong here." For some reason unknown to him, Hiveltak felt compelled to answer the being. "I am Hiveltak of the Chastfor," he brought out, even though he tried to rein in his mouth as he spoke the words. "A diplomat from the planet Burindrak. I was sent here to help our relations with Earth." The being seemed to stagger for a moment. "Planet," it mumbled, more to itself than to him. "You're from a different planet?" His gaze turned towards him again. "Are there more of you?" Of course there were. They were a whole people, but somehow, Hiveltak knew that that wasn't the question the being was asking. "Most people avoid Earth," he replied for his resistance. "The planet is too dangerous, for most, but with improving relations—" "No," the being yelled out, and Hiveltak found himself immediately silenced. "No," it then repeated, more quietly. "If Earth and life is too dangerous for them, then—" The being turned his head, looking back at the revolving Moor still barreling towards them. His fist tightening in resolve, it grabbed Hiveltak once more, putting him high up into the air, where he would be out of reach even for the towering beast. "What is it?" Hiveltak asked, feeling control over his voice returned to him, now that the being was distracted. "What are they?" "Something bad," the being replied, as vague as it was certain. "Something that must not feed. They have no name, and it is better that way." Hiveltak swallowed heavily. "The humans, he started, but the being cut him off. "They are safe now," it said. "I let them pass on to where these monstrosities cannot touch them anymore." Hiveltak hesitated for a bit, the obvious question burning on his tongue. However, it took him a long time before he had gathered the courage to ask it. "Will you make me pass on as well?" he finally brought out after a seeming age. The being seemed to contemplate that, but ultimately it shook its head. "I left you here because I had questions," it said thoughtfully, and seemed to look off into the distance. "And now I see that you would never make it there." "I wouldn't make it?" Hiveltak asked confusedly. He thought that the place this being had sent the humans to was the place better than this. However, it seemed that he was mistaken. "You couldn't even wait for me without help," the being said darkly. "The humans are hardy, and they have walked this world and the next for a long time. They know what to do. You? It paused for a moment to look at Hiveltak intently. You wouldn't. Hiveltak blinked slowly. Then what are you going to do with me? He asked the all-important question. The bean seemed to contemplate that for a bit. Then it turned its head back, and with a single beat of its wings, it catapulted itself and Hiveltak through the air, back down the mountain, in the direction from which smoke was still rising up into the sky even now. With a wild dive, they descended from the heavens, landing right next to the wreckage of the plane, with a landing so violent that Hiveltak was sure that it should have shattered all his internal structures. The bean let go of him, and left him to stand there, as it slowly walked to the rubble of the plane. A hand extended. It let its fingers glide alongside the broken and bent remains of the vehicle's walls, before finally coming to a halt about halfway down. Standing there, it waved Hiveltak over towards it. Feeling that there was no sense in disobeying at this point, Hiveltak hurried over to it. This is it, the bean said, and pointed at a place behind the plane's wall. This is where your body lies on the other side. The other side? His body? What did that... I... died? Hiveltak asked breathlessly, as the realization hit him. The bean nodded. Dying on Earth is the only way to enter this place, it said. It was never meant to be reached by the likes of you. I don't know what happens in death on your planet, but clearly it's nothing like this. Never meant to be reached by the likes of him? No, surely not. Earth's children were strong. They were hardy. They were fast. Few others would survive the onslaught he had endured here in this realm, even if they just had to make it until this being arrived. And apparently what waited even further beyond was even more challenging than this. How many would feed these monstrosities, should they find their end on Earth? What happens now? Hiveltak asked the bean. The bean elegantly turned his weapon around, pointing at him with the blunt hilt. I will send you back, it simply stated, and you will go die somewhere else once your time comes, and then we will have to prepare. Prepare for more like you to come. The floodgates have now been opened, it seems. I will warn the people not to come, Hiveltak announced, but the bean just somberly shook its head. You won't remember, it said quietly, and even if you did, I won't deny the people Earth. It is too beautiful not to be seen, and some of those who see it die. That is part of its beauty. It seemed to take a deep breath, although Hiveltak was quite sure that the bean didn't actually breathe. Then it turned towards him again. It will hurt. It will be scary. You are still heavily wounded, and you will be surrounded by the dead, it announced. But you will live. I'm sorry that you can't prepare for it, but it is what is best for everyone. Hiveltak wanted to say something again, but he didn't get the chance. As quickly as it had sliced through the humans earlier, it thrust against him with the weapon's hilt, sending him into a deep darkness. With a start, Hiveltak awoke, surrounded by death and fire. The plane must have crashed while he was asleep. Desperately, he tried to remember what happened, while his whole body ached.